works in advancing equity and closing social gaps. We also need to make the case to our colleagues, trustees, and staff that the concern with equity is not simply a humanitarian gesture or even a moral imperative. It is part of the larger struggle for the soul of our democracy. I have spent enough time living and working overseas to conclude that the best way to demonstrate the efficacy of our democracy to critics abroad is to demonstrate that it can work equitably for all of our citizens at home. I am increasingly convinced that we may need a new language of self-interest in order to attract and motivate a national constituency committed to eliminating these continuing deficits in our democracy. Too many Americans are like a cartoon I recall from the 60s. It was a picture of a boat with a hole in the middle and a group huddled on each side of the boat, with one group saying, "Gee, that's a nasty leak. Thank God it's on the other side of the boat." We simply have to convince more Americans that we are all in the same boat, and that in a competitive world economy, we will either float together or we will drown together. My sixth and final observation: a foundation seriously interested in promoting equity should think creatively about how to use all of its assets for this purpose, not just conventional capital, but its social, intellectual, reputational, and moral capital as well. And so I want to conclude by pointing to at least 5 forms of capital that are available to foundations interested in promoting equity. The first is the most obvious: the use of conventional capital for grant making. But there are many other ways a foundation can have an impact to the grant-making process. How many foundations, for example, require a diversity profile of nonprofits applying for a grant? That may seem like a small step to some. Yet I have sat on the boards of large and influential nonprofits where the CEO or other board members were much more assertive on equity and diversity when they were able to say that a potential or actual donor intended to include the organization's performance in this area as part of its guidelines for deciding whether or not to make a grant. Quite frankly, as a board member, it has often helped to put teeth into my own urging in that regard. Conventional capital can be used to promote equity in other important ways as well. A foundation can invest some of its endowed assets for the same social purpose as grant making. The Nobel Prize was recently awarded to an economist in Bangladesh for his work in developing the Grameen Bank. He demonstrated in the midst of many doubters that microloans could energize the entrepreneurial spirit in low-wealth communities around the world. His microcredit scheme has been called economic and social development from below. He introduced the concept in 1976 with just $27 from his own pocket. 30 years later, the bank has 6.6 million borrowers, of which 97% are women, who have gained a great measure of independence and self-sufficiency through the infusion of a small amount of capital in the right place at the right time under the right leadership. A collaborative program-related investment strategy by a group of foundations that use some small portion of their assets for microloans could far exceed the impact of the Grenene Bank. In addition to conventional capital, foundations also possess a great amount of social capital that can be used to build a culture of collaboration in grant making as well as in learning. The government sector is all too often paralyzed by politics, and the business sector is all too often preoccupied with profits. The unique calling of philanthropy demands that we engage in a new fusion of expertise, a combination of public and private institutions willing to engage deeply in a problem, and of private donors skeptical enough to look around the outer edges of what these institutions and individuals think they see. It is this kind of partnership that Peter Drucker has called the fourth sector, and it is this kind of partnership that must be the new reality for philanthropy in the 21st century. The third asset of a foundation that is often underutilized is its intellectual capital. Many nonprofits are like Thoreau at Walden Pond. They build castles in the sky, and then they set out to put foundations under them. No pun intended. Foundations can help ground their passion into persuasive evidence by exposing them to the best information, the best ideas, and the best practices that can help shape both community discourse and community actions. Studies and polling conducted directly by foundations or supported by foundations provide data and insights that can change attitudes and develop new insights. I find that when I use foundation studies about the high cost of being poor, for example, how people in low-wealth communities pay more for what their higher wealth counterparts pay less, I'm often able to dispel the notion held by many that the poor are poor because of poor work habits, sick because of poor health habits, and marginalized because of poor social skills. Promoting equity means focusing not simply on the poor who are unemployed, but also the working poor who find themselves falling behind rather than getting ahead. More parents than ever are working. 2.5 million people transitioned from welfare to work over the last decade. But the working poor still face significant obstacles to getting out of poverty. Simply participating in the workforce is more costly in low-wealth communities, where the poor often lack affordable transportation, affordable child care, affordable health care, and affordable housing. But these are not the only ways in which the working poor end up paying more. They pay more for financial transactions, whether it is interest on a mortgage, the cost of tax preparation, or simply cashing a check. They pay more for basic need items of lower quality, and they are victims of predatory lending and often low credit ratings that cause them to pay more for goods often that others pay less. A recent study by the Brookings Institution called this a ghetto tax. Foundations are uniquely positioned to use their intellectual capital to both educate the public about why many of the poor remain poor and what needs to be done to level the playing field. The most overlooked contribution of foundations may be the provision of what Robert Putnam has called reputational capital. Like conventional capital for conventional borrowers, foundations can use their social capital as a kind of collateral for those whose formal credentials and written proposals understate their potential and reliability. A grant is a good housekeeping seal of approval that says to other potential funders that the foundation has done due diligence and find this organization credible, accountable, and effective. And finally, a word about moral capital. There has to be, at all levels, both board and staff, a moral thermostat that flips when we are confronted by injustice, inequity, or callous behavior in our foundations, in the foundation community, or in the larger society. Equity cannot be simply a program area we fund. It has to be something we practice, something we live. There is nothing more reflective of a foundation's values than how it treats those who seek its support. Promoting equity must also include providing respect. It is important for us to understand that how we give is as important as what we give. There's a story told about the exit of the British from one of their former colonies that I think makes this point. On the day in which the colonial officials were about to depart, the Governor General was overheard to say, "When we came here, these people had few roads, but we built new roads. They had few hospitals, almost no hospitals, and we built hospitals. We built new schools, but now they show no appreciation and they ask us to go. Why?" A peasant, on overhearing this conversation, interrupted to say, "It is easy to understand, Your Honor. Every time you look at us, you have the wrong look in your eyes." Philanthropy aimed at advancing equity must begin with a look at its own policies and procedures. Unless we have a new look in our eyes, our efforts will not only be in vain, but if left unattended, could damage our image, diminish our influence, and defer the dreams of those who give birth to the visions we seek to advance. Now, all of this may seem like a long and difficult agenda for philanthropy and equity, but in the final analysis, it may just be, that the most important role of philanthropy is to help provide hope for the many who remain hopeless. It must be the kind of hope Václav Havel had in mind when he said, "I'm not an optimist because I do not believe that everything ends well, nor am I a pessimist because I do not believe that everything ends badly. But I could not accomplish anything if I did not have hope within me. For the gift of hope is as big a gift as the gift of life itself." An increasing number of Americans are living without hope. So please remember, in all you do to promote equity, that you provide not only help, but you provide hope. And the gift of hope is as big a gift as the gift of life itself. Thank you very much.
We do have about 15 minutes or so for questions and answers, and having been in this situation before, I want to emphasize that it is a question and answer, not speech and answer. So please be brief and succinct in your questions. We'll have microphones set up on either side. Please come up, introduce yourself briefly, and ask the question. Thank you.
While you're coming up, let me say that one of the reasons that I probably am not still in Indiana is that I seem to be allergic to everything that moves in this state. And the reason I've had to keep taking a drink of water is because I take a lot of antihistamine when I'm in Indiana, and I am always dried out.
Ambassador Joseph,